So just another chart to sort of show the impact. 2008-9 was a very significant year for water trade, so I've chosen this one as showing when probably the biggest volumes were traded because of the conditions. And it shows the aggregate, you can see the volumes moving in different directions and the aggregate effects. So I think the important point is that allocations were very uneven through those connected trading areas, and that created opportunity. And as a result of the aggregation of lots of individual decisions, the Murrumbidgee was a major exporter of water, mainly to the South Australian Murray, and water was being traded from growers of annual crops to horticulturalists, and obviously that meant that they could preserve the value of their assets, their permanent plantings. So it was a very significant buffer in terms of the impacts of the drought by that stage. We have done a very significant report, which I hope some of you have seen, on the impacts of water trade, and this was actually required of us in our Act. And I won't go through the findings that are summarised up there in detail, because I think most of you would be aware of them. The importance of water trade as a business tool, the fact that it wasn't outward trade really wasn't driving socioeconomic outcomes at the regional level. Certainly at a more local level you could see some impacts, but there were still usually some bigger drivers of change for those communities. And the economic benefits are considerable. In 2008-9, we estimated that they were in the order of $370 million in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, so certainly not an economic outcome to be sneezed at. Drilling down further, the work that we've done to support this, and all of these documents, of course, are available on our website, we've now supported that work by a whole series of case studies, which I think are actually very interesting, which look at individual industries and how they have taken advantage of water trade and what it has meant in terms of the management strategies that are available in those industries. So we've looked at industries like rice and cotton and dairy and horticulture and so on. And I think the most important thing is how quickly and how entrenched a management tool the ability to trade has become. And I don't think anybody in those industries would like to see a turning back, because it has really allowed them to optimise their businesses to a very large extent. And what we've then done is taken it down to another level again, which is to actually look at individual irrigators. So we have these quite slender documents here. So here's the cotton industry case study there. And here is an individual irrigator case study. This is Pat and Michelle Quinn from Minchell West in Victoria. So dairy farmers. And it talks in quite a lot of detail about the strategies they've used to make better use of their water asset. And together they give you a very rich picture. So for people who are looking for sort of goods, I wouldn't say it's anecdotal, it's stronger than that. It's a great resource bank that we've built up describing that. So I might then just go back up a level to the kind of policy universe, and just specifically on water trade, where is that going? Because we just have seen such benefits from it, but the market is still immature in lots of ways. So we did a substantial piece of work called Strengthening Australia's Water Markets last year, and that was really looking at the nitty-gritty of how those markets operate and how they could be improved, and particularly responding to some concerns that were beginning to be expressed by participants in the market about how it was regulated and so on. But I think one of the biggest conclusions from that really is that there's a whole area which is still out with the market. Obviously, Western Australia and Northern Territory and the ACT in places which still don't really enable trade, but also groundwater. I mean, there's a huge resource which is not still in such a strong entitlement framework as surface water, and remembering the initiative talks about managing surface and groundwater, partly managing them as an interconnected resource, which largely they are, but also thinking about them in the same sort of conceptual frame. And that requires a different planning sort of approach often, but still there's some serious opportunity there that hasn't yet been harvested. Very important that the approval processes of trade are transparent and efficient, and there are still issues there. Some concerns about conflict of interest, particularly where environmental water holders may or may not be able to trade and may or may not be operating independently from the government department, which is making policy decisions about allocations and so on. So there's concern about that, but it's really a matter of having robust institutional arrangements that can demonstrate and transparency of decision making around all of that. Markets work better if there is good quality price information, and that is published, and how decisions are made. As I mentioned, there are some concerns about the business practices of water intermediaries. We haven't yet gone to the point of arguing that they should be separately regulated beyond the existing frameworks that can be applied to any intermediary, but it's certainly a watching brief on that. And as I said earlier, developing markets where they're still nascent. So there's a lot of still upside to continue to implement the reforms, and that's just one thin slice that I've just whipped through in great speed. So finally, just going up one further level, to take you right back to the beginning where I was talking about the initiative as a whole, the 2011 assessment. It's a very weighty document, but I think it's been a very thorough one and will be an important reference point for a long time. At the conclusion of that, we made just 12 recommendations, and we grouped them in these 3 sections. And so I'll just conclude by just pointing to those without really sort of talking about the rationale behind them, or else I'd be here for another 2 hours. The most important one, I guess, in a way, is around leadership. Reform is tough, and it will only happen if there is vigorous leadership. And in the case of water reform, it requires the leadership of COAG because of the nature of the beast. And we think that is still required, so we make some recommendations to them about their role. And, particularly that means not just committing to the reforms, not just putting the resources in place so that those reforms can be given effect, but also really explaining them. And as we know to our cost, very often major reforms, great reasons for them, the public and the people who are affected still don't understand the rationale and probably have many fears about the impact on them that are actually not based in what the reform is. So leadership does include communication. The second thing about leadership is that there really is a lot of unfinished business in the initiative, and it still is an enduring blueprint for water reform. And it's central to that, as I said, was delivering the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, but beyond the basin, growing entitlements and markets so that other parts of Australia can have the benefits that we've seen in the basin. So that is still a very important execution task within the initiative itself. In terms of the maturing agenda, there are some areas where the National Water Initiative was not very explicit, or things that really emerged later on as being bigger issues than we recognised at the time that the initiative was put in place. And so we make some recommendations about how to deal with those. And I think the biggest things there would be, first of all, the urban water agenda was not well articulated, and there's a lot of issues there. Moving away from just thinking in terms of quantity to a better integration between quantity and quality. They're not independent variables, so that's an important thing. And that really means a greater coordination between water management and natural resource management. Some of this sounds like Back to the Future, I think, but it doesn't mean to say that it's wrong. So we've had a little bit of sort of divergence, probably need to bring those together. And of course, there are some areas where there are still some significant carve-outs and gaps, the biggest one being the mining and petroleum industries. And they really do need to be brought into the National Water Initiative planning and management framework. So there needs to be some integration. Some new policy areas like climate change, which is going to be my future life. Again, does water policy and climate change policy, do they sort of interact well? And there are probably other things that urban planning, there's all sorts of things where those interactions need to be kept at least a watching brief on. And finally, the making it happen thing, and this is as important as the leadership, which is doing water management well is requires resources, and governments are ultimately the stewards of the resource. And like, I always use the analogy of business. If you are the board of a company, you are responsible to your shareholders for the management of those assets. So that is a real stewardship function, and that means you have to invest in good systems. You have to have a CFO. You have to do all of those things. And similarly, so do governments with respect to the water resource that they are the stewards of. And so there's a whole load of areas where that could be done better, where there could be better coordination and collaboration, particularly around the science agenda, where the scarce resources in science could be better pulled together in a sort of strategic, so the investment is really strategic. And again, given the nature of our federation, vertical fiscal imbalance is something that we all have to live with, but that does mean that incentives for reform will remain, I think, an important part, so that although we don't presume to tell how it might construct those incentives, we think that still continues to be an important part of the recipe, if you like, for achieving enduring water reform in this nation. Thank you.